Hi, my name is Alan, and I am a hypocrite. I know that it's strange for me to say this in this worship service on a Sunday morning because it's a Christian worship service, and of course that word comes from the word Christ, and the Christ is the one who wasn't exactly that happy with hypocrisy. If you were a hypocrite in Jesus' time, you got called a whitewashed tomb or a den of serpents, right? A brood of vipers. You didn't want to be on the other end of that finger when Jesus started to talk about hypocrisy. And by the way, you don't like hypocrites either. In fact, you know how words can be morphed so that when they start out being negative, the English language can be morphed. So how many of you remember when the word bad actually meant really good, right? And my son, if he sees a great play on the sports field, will say, "Ooh, that's sick. That was filthy," right? We know how these words morph, but have you ever tried to morph hypocrite? You know, that guy, I love that guy, he's such a hypocrite. Right? We never use that. It's in the semantic range of axe murderer. And yet, I am a hypocrite. When I was a young hypocrite. We had to run the 50-yard dash to get in the sort of President's Physical Fitness Award when I was a kid, and I ran a time that was fast enough to get that award, but I had to have others think that I had run faster. I jimmied my time a little lower. When I got to high school, I'd score all right on a test. I'd hit a 95, but people would ask what I got, and I'd say, "High 90s." Right? Got to college, and in my college, a Christian college, the currency was seeming spiritual. And so to be a big man on campus, I knew what I needed to do. And so I would drop into the occasional conversation, "Yeah, I was thinking about that this morning when I was up at 5 doing my devotionals." Got to graduate school. Let me tell you something. Graduate students are poor. They don't have any money. It's a stereotype because it's true. Graduate students are poor. And I was poor. I had a door, and the wood that they make door out of, and I had it on 2 blocks, and that was my desk. I had a single mattress, not a bed, and I had a one metal folding chair as my furniture. That was my whole little room that I rented. And yet when I went out, we'd go out for wings at Archie's in New Haven, and I would grab the bill and pay it with my credit card. I went pretty deeply into credit card debt because I needed to seem more well-to-do than I actually was. When I was a young professional, I started to golf a little more seriously, and I'd shoot an 85, but tell people I was low 80s. And any time a book got mentioned, whether I'd read it or not, I would nod my head feverishly as if I had. Right? I am a hypocrite. Do you see the pattern? No good deed goes unpublished, and no okay deed goes unembellished. And I have this problem because Jesus doesn't like hypocrisy, and neither do you. Now, you're probably at this point in my message, you're probably wanting to scream out, "Alan, this is all nice. We're glad you can unburden yourself, but have you been oblivious the last 5 or 6 weeks? Dave Haney and Travis Taylor have been taking us through this magnificent verse in the Bible, Philippians 4:8, where we hear whatever is true, whatever is respectable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, where we hear that we're supposed to think on that kind of thing. So whatever is true, respectable, right, pure, lovely, hypocritical. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. Hypocrisy doesn't belong in this series, Alan. You're wanting to scream it out. Last week we were in the beautiful realm of Dave's art supply, right? And this week you're taking us to an AA meeting in a church basement with bad coffee. What are you doing? What happened, friends, that when Dave asked me, and I'm so honored to get to be a part of this series, when Dave asked me to preach, he gave me the next word after lovely, from which you got beautiful last week. He gave me the word admirable. Admirable. It's an admirable word, right? It seems like you could just throw it in and stay right on tune. But I want to look at the Greek word for it, because that's what we do around here, right? I want to look at the Greek word for it, because that way you might be able to understand why I put it where I put it in the things we're doing. So if I could get the slide for the Greek word is eupheme, and it comes from two Greek words. The small one you know, EU, and you know it because it comes out in evangelist. An evangelist is somebody who preaches the good, the angelia, the news. Good news, gospel, that's a you word. Also, euphoria. When you feel great, you feel good, you is the beginning of that word, right? Well, in the Greek word eupheme, it is good, and then the second word, pheme, comes from a whole lot of words that means to speak or say, right? And so eupheme means to be spoken well of, and that's why, I read 30 translations this week, because that's what you do when you're given one word, right? I read 30 translations and compared them, and about half of them tilted toward of good report, of good reputation, of good repute. The other half went where Dave went to admirable or respectable or commendable, right? So this word says to be well spoken about, to be admired, to be admirable, right? And I don't know about you, but somewhere in my Christian-trained mind, that throws an alarm, because there's this time when Jesus, in a very famous moment, decided that he would take his disciples and go up this little hill. It wasn't really a mountain, although it got called the Sermon on the Mount, and he would teach them the basics of the kingdom of God, that he would teach them what his way was, what his role was. And he started with, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the poor in spirit, all the Beatitudes. And then he moved over to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, which is not a bad idea during an election season, by the way, right? But then he came in chapter 6 to the part that I'm thinking of. Because in chapter 6, verse 1, he says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of people in order to be seen by them. That's the alarm that went off in my mind, because he goes on to picture three ludicrous little folks. One stands up during the offering. Dave introduced the offering this morning, right? Stand up during the offering and have somebody play a trumpet as he puts his money in, so that everybody will know just how generous he is, right? Stop the presses, I gave money at church. Right? The second one is somebody who doesn't pray in her study or in her closet or in her living room. She goes out on the street corner and shouts it out so that everybody can see that she's the holy kind of person who prays. Right? And the third is that fasting person, that person who stops eating, and there's a spiritual fast, there is a spiritual discipline, but this one wants to be seen, so they look disheveled and they put ashes and sackcloth on and try to look like they're really a faster. Right? Jesus warned us that seeking admiration is a blind alley, is a dead end, warned us that you get called hypocrite for doing that, for doing something so that people will see you, for being commendable, admirable in a way, right? And so in my mind I go to, wait a second, Do I want to think on admirable things? That might tempt me in, or do I want to avoid that word? Because you and I, and here's where I bring you in, you and I, from the time we came out of the womb, have had this eye for what people like and don't like, and we get pretty good at playing to our crowd, don't we? You know what thing will most please the person with you, and if you've got good antennae, you can shift from crowd to crowd and do what each wants, right? Well, the word hypocrite comes from an ancient Greek part of their world that wasn't a moral or religious part of their world. The word hypocrite comes from the ancient theater. Did you know that? The ancient theater, the ancient stage, where they would put masks on as they did the play to separate themselves from their daily life. The actor was called a hypocrite, hypocrites, right? The actor was called a hypocrite, so they'd put on these masks in order to differentiate themselves, in order to take on their role in the play, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's what actors do, right? Actors take on a separate role, so it wasn't judged as negative, but pretty soon people put two and two together and said, I know people who are like that in life. I know people who are a different person at home than they are on the street. I know people who are different in different settings, and they started to use that word hypocrite to describe people with two faces. You ever heard two-faced used positively? Right? And so the word hypocrite came in order to present a person who tries to make a better face than they really have. I knew a guy in Connecticut. Reputation where I was in Connecticut was very important. So he worked long years at this firm in downtown Manhattan, and he would every day get in the train, get in his work clothes, go to the train, go into Midtown Manhattan, and do his work, and then he'd come home, but then he got fired. He got released. And he spent the next 6 months getting up, dark 30, getting his work clothes on, getting on the train, and traveling into Manhattan just so nobody would know he was not employed. Right? We care a lot about what other people think. I know a woman who was so keen on having the perfect family that she leaned into her kids and she made them overachieve, and it wore the kids out, and pretty soon they had to have some serious therapy because this woman wanted the family to look better than they could even be. You and I have this thing. We have this thing where we like to look good to people, and we like even to look better than we are. So why do we do that? Why do we use all that energy? After all, it's an exhausting job to be a 24/7 self-promoter, right? Think of Facebook. I don't know how people keep up with making themselves look so good on Facebook, right? Psychologists have named something called the Facebook syndrome. Do you know that? Facebook syndrome is people who get depressed because they go on Facebook and everybody there seems to have gotten that job or had that marriage or had that anniversary, or their kids have gotten that part in the play or won that championship, or you know the drill. Facebook becomes a highlight reel of life rather than real life. And people who go on there feel like, I must be nothing because these people seem perfect. Right? Why do we spend the energy? Why do we spend the energy, the exhausting energy of keeping people liking us, keeping people happy with us, keeping people admiring us? Why do we work so hard? Well, I have a theory about that. I think that I think that people who labor hard to make people admire them or think better of them than they really are. I think people like that, and I include myself, I think people like that doubt the love of God, really. They don't think God could really love them. We don't think God could really love us just as we are. Right? We imagine that we're pretty unlovable by a perfect being, and we think of God as judge, so we don't think that we can be loved by God, so we trade that in and think, well, maybe I'll try to make people like me. But we don't really trust that people will like us until we work hard for their favor. And so we hyper engage and we put on the show and we put on that mask and hope they will. Paul was on this. The Apostle Paul was on this a couple thousand years ago. Paul ran into the truth in his own life and ran into the truth in people around him. And it broke through from the heavens, literally, that God loved him before he ever lifted a finger. It came to be known as his doctrine or his theory of salvation by grace through faith. Right? No one is saved by works, said Paul. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And that not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one should boast. Ephesians 2:8 and 9, and he wrote this to the Romans, and he wrote this to the Galatians, and he wrote this to the Ephesians, and he wrote it to the Philippians because everybody needed to be reminded about it. But then, of course, they remembered it for 15 or 20 minutes, but they forgot it, so he had to write back to the Galatians and make sure they weren't kind of leaving the fold. In fact, the church just kept getting a little farther and a little farther away, so that 1,500 years later, God had to send Martin Luther just to remind everybody, remember that Paul thing? It's still true. God still loves us more than we can imagine. God still loves us before we lift a finger. But even reading Paul, and even reading Luther, you and I still forget. So how are we going to solve this? How are we going to get this right? How are we going to understand that the God of the universe loves us, period? So I got married. And I think you're going to see a slide of this. I got married to the most amazing woman in the world. Sorry, folks. Got married to the most amazing woman in the world. Her name is Elizabeth Anderson. And we started dating, and I was just dumbfounded by the fact that she wanted to spend time with me. But there she was, wanting to spend time with me. So we started to date, and we had fun together and liked it. And so I thought, I'm going to risk. I'm going to have her over to my house for dinner. Right? I wasn't a great cook, and believe me, my house wasn't the cleanest place in the world. But I was going to have her over to my house for dinner because that's what really charming men do. And so I invited her for 6 o'clock on a Saturday night, and all day was spent interspersed, get the food ready and clean the whole doggone house because I don't know how to put it. Maybe the best way to put this is I am clutter tolerant. Right? There was stuff everywhere, and I didn't have time to put everything back in its place. So my method, I will put everything in the clutter room. My room. And so I started shoving everything off the floors into my room, and I think they're going to flash a messy room, or they may already have. Mine was much messier than that, right? There was stuff upon stuff. There were Burger King wrappers, there were old newspapers, there were magazines, there was golf equipment, and then there were tons of clothes. It was up to here, right? It was a high archaeological dig kind of layers of clutter, and I just got done. It's about 5:55, and I'm getting the last things into my room, and I shove it, and I shove it closed, and then the door latches, and I breathe a deep sigh of relief just as the doorbell rings, and this beautiful, amazing woman, Liz, comes in, and I say, "Come on in. Can I take your coat?" And I do everything right. Would you like a glass of wine? And then we talked for a while, but she said, "Hey, let me see the house." And I had the door closed, so I was fine. We went through the kitchen and the living room and the study, and everything was going fine. And she said, "Well, what's upstairs?" And with a little trepidation, we started upstairs, and a horrifying image took shape. The door had come open to the clutter room. And there it was, all of my mess, all of my clutter, all that I wanted to hide about myself, right there before God and Liz and everyone. And I started to compose my exit line. "Oh, it's been really nice knowing you," because I was sure that she was going to just turn around and leave with some vain, kind of tiny excuse that she was going to just leave because nobody wants to stay with that kind of clutter, right? But then something miraculous happened. We're standing there looking into the maw of hell. And she just laughs. She says, "Whoa, where's the next room?" And folks, in that moment, I found out two things. One, I found out something about Liz. I found out that she was capable, miracle of miracles, of liking me even with my stuff, even with my clutter. And you can imagine there was a lot of relief in that. But you know, it went beyond it. Because somehow in that moment, I got a glimpse of the God of the universe. In that moment, I suddenly got that God loved me in spite of. And my life changed. Friends, we don't have to be admired. We don't have to be admired. We don't have to work so hard. Riverbend can become the kind of place where people gather and like one another even without, and it's going to sound hard in the COVID era, but even without the masks we generate, right? That we can love one another in spite because the God of the universe loves us, right? I've spent the last couple weeks trying to imagine who the most admirable people I know are. Because once you know that the God of the universe loves you, period, you're playing with house money. You don't have to try to get people to like you. So who are the people who are admirable just as they are? And my mind keeps going back to the special needs community. I don't know if you've got direct contact with special needs folks. I know a lot of special needs parents. In the last congregation I served, there was actually a large fellowship of them. And I'm going to tell you the story of one couple because they are admirable. Let me tell you quickly their story. Their names are Autumn and Chris Toussaint. They're friends of mine. They're these brilliant people. She is a brilliant actress and musician. He is a brilliant tennis player and friend and Christian man. And they were just young people in love, so they decided to get married. And then they were young married people in love, and they were having a great time, but they decided to have a family. And so she got pregnant, and the date was coming, and finally the date came, and they went in, and she had the baby, and there was a problem. There were things awry. In fact, there were lots of things awry, and at some point shortly after, the doctor sat them down and ran them through that their son, Kevin, had spina bifida. And it was high in the back, high in the spine, and that he had a whole laundry list of other things, including that his two brain hemispheres were not bridged in the way they ought to be. So the doctor told it to them straight. He will never be able to see more than 3 feet. He will never be able to talk. He will never to really be able to function socially. He will be unable probably to sit up, certainly never to walk. Right? And you can imagine the thump that went into these two lives. Chris had imagined a Wimbledon champ, and Autumn had imagined somebody on Broadway because that was their passions, and they had imagined a future, and all of a sudden this doctor had put an axe in the middle of their future. So Autumn kindly asked her way out of the room and went to the restroom and just collapsed on the floor and started sobbing because the future she knew would come wasn't going to come. So she sobbed and sobbed, but then she got up, and they went home, and they prayed, and they talked, and they prayed, and they talked, and they decided that they could deny this, or that they could accept it and love this child for all the child is worth. And they blessedly, as people playing with house money, they blessedly chose the second. Kevin's my kid's age now. He sings beautifully. They've put all of their life into all of his life. He's funny. He has this wry little mischievous look. He's watching Auburn yesterday. This is a recent picture, just yesterday. Bad day for Auburn fans. Kevin has become this brilliant, he can't talk where you hear every word and understand it. He can't walk, but he's become this brilliant person who is funny and sings beautifully and is a magnet for the people around him just because he's been loved well. And they didn't do it because they would get admired for it. Special needs parents don't have time to think about that. They did it because their God loved them and they had some extra to give. They knew that God loved them so they could love Kevin. And that's admirable, right? A great English author, George Eliot, wrote, I think, her best novel, Middlemarch, about Dorothea. This is George Eliot, but about Dorothea, who is a woman who would have been a saint in another era. The narrator compares her to Saint Teresa of Avila. She would have been a saint. She would have been famous in other eras, but she was born in the mid-1800s in England in a part of the country where she couldn't do things because she was a woman or because of the place, and she was never admired. This big spirit that had nowhere to go, and it got kind of channeled out into small things, and everything looked messy, so nobody admired her. She was of ill repute in the town at some points because people misunderstood her. Middlemarch ends with a quote that we should remember as we think about admirable things. The growing good of the world, writes George Eliot, is partly dependent on unhistoric acts. And that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. Friends, we are the children of a God who loves us, period. We are the children of a God who loves us before we lift a finger. We are the children of a God who loves our face even with its blemishes. What do you say we put down those kinds of masks? What do you say we stop presenting to the world what we think they'll like and just be admirable? The God of the universe loves your face. There's plenty of love to go around. And that's good news. Amen?